Well, the relationship has fundamentally changed in the way that Chomsky mentioned. People don't remember that in the 1950s, in addition to blocking the Israeli, French, and British attack on Egypt, the United States had an arms embargo on Israel. Far from being Israel's main military supporter, we kept our distance. At that time, the principal support for Israel came from France and sometimes from the Soviet Union. In the 1964 election, which was Lyndon Johnson against Barry Goldwater, Lyndon Johnson had a momentous meeting on Long Island, which is the suburbs of New York, basically, with a group of prominent Jewish plutocrats, and basically agreed to support Israel in return for their financial support for his campaign. This began a progression of increased political influence by ardent supporters of Israel. And in the 1970s, AIPAC was formed. It was originally more of an educational institution than anything else, but it was transformed into a lobbying organization of incredible power. And the result is you see the Congress critters behaving like trained seals, flapping their flippers, hoping that someone will throw them a herring or some other sort of fish in the form of money. So this was a national disgrace, in my view. It was a travesty in democratic terms. I imagine the world beyond our borders saw it as a disgrace for democracy, rather than as an advertisement for it. But there are now two very good studies of the Israel lobby and its power. One is the original one by Steve Walt and John Mearsheimer, called the Israel Lobby, which is a very dull, dry, but meticulously footnoted examination of the lobby and its influence and its impact on U.S. Israel and U.S. West Asian relations. The other is a recent book by Ilan Pappé, which I've not read yet, but which I'm told is excellent. He, of course, is an Israeli historian and a very free thinker. And in the very best Jewish tradition of tellers of truth to power, people who are fearlessly objective in examining the facts and following empirical results wherever they lead. So these are two books which people can read to inform themselves on the subject of the Zionist lobby. It's not, I think it's probably misnamed the Israel lobby. It is able to command the attention of the American political elite in the manner that Mr. Netanyahu demonstrated during his appearance before Congress last month.
If I can ask you a little bit about how you interpret the relationship of the Democratic Party with that of Israel, because on one hand, they are in very direct support of sending weapons, sending more money in the form of military aid, in giving all forms of diplomatic cover, in participating in Israeli propaganda, information war, and so on. On the other hand, there are certain minimum criteria on which they seem to disagree on, whether it's about the ground invasion of Rafah, or a ceasefire, apparently, some sort of a ceasefire, or the escalation in the Middle East. So there seems to be a tension. A lot of people think it was around the time of Obama when these tensions started to simmer. How do you look at the relationship between Democratic Party in general and Israel?
Well, I think it's contradictory. in many ways, the relationship exemplifies the current tension between the mass and the elite, with much of the general public or the basic members of the Democratic Party not at all in sync with the party leaders. This is exactly what did in Hillary Clinton. Her description of the mass of the people as deplorables reflected elite distance from mass opinion. And there's just recently been an opinion poll which shows that the majority of the American people now oppose helping to defend Israel given its behavior. I believe the figure for the Democratic Party members is only 15% approval of supporting the defense of Israel directly with U.S. intervention. I think for independents, it's in the 40% range. Republicans, a slight majority, support defending Israel, but it's not a very large majority. This is a great change in public opinion, but it is not reflected in the party superstructure, if you will. This is an aspect of the implosion of democracy in the United States and other democracies. I won't name others particularly, but I think you can come up with a list where the same phenomenon of elite estrangement from popular opinion is prevalent.
I remember Dr. Gabor Mate once said, and I think this was during the time of those campus encampments in the US universities, he said that it's very heartening to see these democratic outbursts, but he ultimately expressed skepticism because he said empires take a long time to die out, and these democratic voices do not translate immediately, particularly when it comes to foreign relations.
Well, I have the utmost respect for Gabor Mate, who is a man who is really very superior at ethical reasoning, a very compassionate human being, and he's given the world a wonderful son in the form of Aaron Mate, who I think is probably the best young journalist operating now in the United States, at any rate. Gabor Mate is Canadian, Hungarian by birth, obviously. But I don't agree with him on this. I think the immediate effect of the protests was to exacerbate the distance between the elite and the public. I do agree with him that the protesters had a certain nobility about them. Maybe there is nobility in failure. Mm-hmm. I've heard the Japanese argue that. But in the end, they have been badly slapped down by the establishment. And not just the U.S. Congress, but state governors. Kamala Harris was considering appointing Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, as her running mate. She chose instead Tim Walz of Minnesota, which I think was a wise choice. Had Josh Shapiro been her running mate, I think this would have immediately alienated much of youth and people of color in the United States. And it would not have been a winning strategy because he's a hardline Zionist. He actually served in the Israeli occupation forces at one point. And when the protesters appeared on the University of Pennsylvania campus, he acted very harshly against them and condemned them as agents of Hamas, which is the Hasbara or propaganda stance of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs in Israel. So he would have been, in the current context, very controversial. Prior to October 7th, he wouldn't have been. Mm-hmm. But there is now a change, and it is not yet reflected in the superstructure of party politics although it may be becoming more and more apparent at that level.
We also have the example, the precedence of the American war in Vietnam, how democratic protests actually had an immediate impact. You mentioned Ilan Pape and Aaron Mate. They are joining us this month and the next month. So just wanted to plug that in. I want to move to the Middle East with this final question on the US. If you could briefly comment on your views on the Republican Party vis-a-vis its relationship with Israel, because there is one side, even many on the left, who says that the Democratic Party is so bad that the Republican Party can't be worse. And there are others who would say that Trump would be the easiest person for the Israeli lobby. He walked the US out of the Iranian nuclear deal. He changed the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which was like there for a long time. I think it's since 1995 there was a bill, if I'm not mistaken, but he did it in 2018. What are your views on that?
Well, the Republican Party is clearly no longer the party it once was. You remember that it arose as a third party in the 1850s on an anti-slavery plank. It was a party of protest against the established regime in the United States. It stood later for fiscal conservatism, prudent management of the government's budget, and it embraced Jeffersonian principles. It wished for a small government. More recently, it evolved. It was no longer for small government when the government was in uniform. It wanted a big military. It always used to say that the Democrats would get the United States into war, and the Republicans would end the war and get them out, get the United States out of the war. But more recently, it has been very bellicose and belligerent. In the case of Israel, it seems that the evolved Republican Party no longer stands for the rule of law at home. It is vindictive and vengeful. For example, it has blocked the judicial process at Guantanamo and kept that unsightly prison in being, along with a lot of people who are there without charge and have no prospect of having a fair trial if they ever are charged. So it has become very hardline, reactionary, if you will, and it therefore finds common cause with Israel, which has undergone a similar evolution. Israel is now a country which is willing to break every law, commit every indecency in the spirit of revenge or just racist hatred. This is the Republican Party now embraces many people who in years past might have been members of the segregationist wing of the Republican Party, racist people. So, you know, the Republicans that I grew up with, who were men and women of principle, are not there anymore. So I think they found a common spirit in the scofflaw behavior of Israel. The ends justify the means. And of course, at the moment, they are in the grips of a very gifted demagogue who we've had such people before in our politics, but they've never made it to the presidency. So now we have a different situation. So I find the Republican Party at the moment does not embrace the Republicans of yesteryear. In many ways, Tim Walz, the vice presidential candidate that Kamala Harris selected could easily have been a Republican in an earlier era. Not now.
Slightly switching gears, one of our members, patrons of the channel, Christina, she asked you to comment on the recent spree of assassination campaigns. I remember reading your book where you strongly voiced against Israeli covert assassination campaigns, and this has been going on for a very long time. Recently, they assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, the chief negotiator of the ceasefire plan, and also they killed the second in military commander, Mohammad Deif, also Hezbollah's military chief, Fouad Shukr, among many others, actually. Your comments after the Iranian response after the Israeli strike in Damascus got a lot of views. So my question to you is, why is the Western media and Western lawmakers and officials in general who talk about international rule of law all the time never speak out against these assassination campaigns? In fact, it's not their silence, but they champion these assassination campaigns. Could you comment on that?
Well, I'm not sure that they champion the campaigns, but they certainly censor the news and deplatform people who are critical. There's a tendency, well, of course, there's been quite a campaign to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, although they're very different things. It's possible to be philo-Semitic, meaning admiring of Jews generally, and to be very anti-Zionist, because Zionism, in a way, is the negation of the traditional values of Judaism. It is a tribal instrument of nationalism rather than a religious conviction to a great extent. So I think the news media, which are now in the West and generally the prisoners of oligopoly, that is corporate mechanisms, or in the case of social media, deliberately designed to aggregate like-minded people in small communities or large communities where they never are exposed to challenges to their fundamental prejudices. This is a news environment which is very easily diverted from examination of the truth. Having said all that, I would strongly recommend a book by Ronan Bergman called Rise and Kill First. Mr. Bergman, who is an Israeli journalist, very close to the Mossad and Shin Bet, sometimes critical, often a mouthpiece for them, wrote this book, and he documents about 3,000 political murders by Israel over the years. Israel has basically followed a practice of killing anybody who might be able to make a deal with it. So the Ismail Haniyeh assassination is very much in this tradition. If Israel kills people who might make a deal with it, it is then in a position to say there's nobody to talk to. And that is exactly what it has been doing. Now, the Ismail Haniyeh and Shukr Fouad Shukr assassinations come in a context. Mr. Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, is beleaguered at home and despised abroad, except in the U.S. Congress, apparently. And he is fighting for his life out of prison. His country is imploding. The effort to recruit, to conscript ultra-Orthodox Jews, Haredim, has been met with protests by them saying they'd rather die than be part of the army. They wish to fulfill their religious responsibilities. They do not wish to kill people or be part of the occupation particularly. The earlier effort by Mr. Netanyahu to end the independence of the Israeli judiciary divided Israelis, and there were huge protests by the more secular liberal element of Israeli society against that. The military in Israel has directly defied Mr. Netanyahu by criticizing him for having no strategy in Gaza and for leading Israel to the abyss. They are against his desire and that of some of his cabinet members to widen the war, or I should say more accurately, intensify it, because it has already been widened. There has been skirmishing going on between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and in northern Israel, the Houthis have joined the fight with the blockade and occasional direct shots at Israel. Iraqi militias have been doing the same, mostly against the U.S. because of the American identification with Israel, but still basically against Israel. And Iran, of course, has been proclaimed by Israel to be its mortal enemy, and has been drawn into at least one major exchange with Israel, which you referred to. So I think the purpose of the assassinations in this context was manifold. First, Israel rules Palestinians through terror, and it deters its neighbors from attacking it also through terror. It is a terrorist state, and it is a prime practitioner of terrorism. After October 7th, a lot of the terror of Israeli capabilities has gone away. The fear of it is still there, but it is not as intense as it was before. So one reason to do this is to restore the reputation of the Israeli intelligence and military services for ruthlessness and invincibility. That was one purpose, mainly domestic in Israel, but related to Israel's stance in the region. The second purpose was to provoke a retaliation that would intensify the war that Israel's already in. In a sense, Israel has been at war for 76 years, since 1948. But Mr. Netanyahu talks about 7 enemies and 7 fronts, and he has an apocalyptic vision that if a huge war can be begun and the United States can be entangled in it, then the United States will consolidate Israel's supremacy in its region. And of course, Israel might take even more territory. There talk about annexing part of Lebanon and so forth and so on. So I think these assassinations were deliberate efforts to provoke a wider conflict that would entangle the United States. And sadly, Mr. Biden's administration seems to be walking into this trap. There are 12 American warships in the Eastern Mediterranean, ostensibly there to prevent and deter a war, but actually to show support for Israel. The head of the Central Command, General Kurilla, is in Israel at the moment to help defend Israel. Lloyd Austin, as you mentioned, I believe the Secretary of Defense has said that we will stand with Israel if there's a war. So there is no pretense of neutrality, objectivity, or whatever. And I will conclude this rant, if you will, with the observation that the United States says, I believe, and I actually believe this is true, that Israel did not consult with us or inform us in advance of its assassinations. We were not involved. At least the latter part is true. I can't be sure of the first part. We were not involved. But this gives us no cover. It does not establish our innocence, because the reason Israel can carry out this kind of outrageous abuse of international law and human rights is because we support it. We enable the assassinations. And this takes me back to your original question. that may be the explanation for why there is the limited criticism of these assassinations that there has been.
I want to have your thoughts on the strength of Iran and Hezbollah and also other allies in the region. We had Norman Finkelstein, and he said that this ongoing conflict has really kind of given a public impression that they are very, very strong. I think he also had the Second Lebanon War in mind, where Hezbollah did fight with tremendous tenacity. On the other hand, there are tremendous economic difficulties. I mean, Lebanese economy is in total doldrums. Iranian economy is not doing very well, to put it very mildly. And a lot of the militias in Iraq or in Yemen are they are not really the state. They don't have a very strong power to collect tax, build up a defense wing, and so on and so forth. What's your take on the strength of this alliance?
Well, let me make a number of comments on context. First, Israel, Mr. Netanyahu and his fellow Yahoos have managed to do something that no one had previously succeeded in doing for 14 centuries, namely uniting Shia and Sunni against a common enemy. Here we have Ismail Haniyeh, the head of a very Sunni resistance movement, feted in Tehran, the capital of Shia Islam. We have Mr. Erdogan, also a noted Sunni, in this case, Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic democracy advocate, building a relationship with Hezbollah and declaring that he will help defend Hezbollah. So this is really quite a major development in historical terms, and I think it's been largely overlooked, and which is why I mention it. And it has to do with your question about the relative strength of these parties. There's one option that must be under consideration, and I think Sergei Shoigu, the Russian national security advisor, former defense minister, went to Tehran to counsel the Iranians not to consider this option. He also went there to supply weapons, which is another aspect of this. I'll come back to that. But the major option would be an all-out assault involving a coordinated move by Hezbollah, Iran, Iraqi militias, the Houthis, and maybe Syria. And it's not impossible to imagine that the Russians, would be disturbed by the prospect of this kind of instability to their south and wish to counsel against it, because they, like the United States and others, really don't want that instability in the region. Unlike the United States, they have the ability to talk to everybody, the Iranians and the Israelis. And I presume they've also cautioned the Israelis about what they've done. So that is one option. But I think we should not underestimate the cleverness of the Iranians and Hezbollah. There is a long, very interesting tradition of strategic thought in Iran. Persian culture is one of those that has developed its own doctrine of national security actions. In India, you have the DISASTROUS. In Iran, they have comparable works, which are very Machiavellian, make Machiavelli look rather modest and innocent. So my concern is that in the search for some way of retaliating that would not bring the United States into a wider war, which Iran doesn't want, nor does Hezbollah, they may respond to these assassinations with counter-assassinations. This is something they have not done in part because of religious scruples. The Holy Quran is quite definite that one cannot kill innocent people. Much like the DISASTROUS, which has multiple chapters on assassination even in the womb, there is this tradition that competes with religious scruples. So I think we should be very concerned that the delay in a reprisal, the deliberations that are going on, will lead to something of this sort, which would be counterterrorism, if you will, on a level that we have not seen. Let me just finish by saying that what Israel has done externally with these assassinations is change the nature of the question that applies. Israel always asked the question, do we have the right to exist? Please acknowledge we have the right to exist. This is a rather odd question because they do exist, of course, and most countries don't go around asking for endorsement of their existence. The implicit requirement here is that if Israel exists, if it has a right to exist, the Palestinians do not have a right to exist, because the basis of Zionism is a Jewish supremacist state that extends through all of historic Palestine, which, by the way, doesn't have very definite borders. That was the question. Then, after October 7, with the savagery of the genocidal war of extermination in Gaza, which is what it is. It's not a war with Hamas. It is a war of extermination. Gaza was a concentration camp that has become an extermination camp. Now, the question was, does Israel deserve to exist when it behaves in this manner? And this is the subject of discussions at the International Court of Justice in The Hague and the International Criminal Court. But I think now, after these assassinations, the question has shifted yet again. And now it is, can the world tolerate the existence of a state that is not just a pariah, but an outlaw, which knows no restraints on its indecency to other human beings? And this brings me finally to another issue that is, in effect, on trial in The Hague. Israelis, others, always have rightly demanded never again. But does never again apply to everybody or only to Jews? That is the question that is on trial in The Hague, because the current Israeli public, as it has emerged from decades of brainwashing about Auschwitz and so on, basically takes the position that never again for Jews. But it's perfectly fine, according to the official rabbi of the Israeli occupation forces, for soldiers to rape Palestinian prisoners on the grounds that they're terrorists and they have no rights. It's perfectly fine, according to a member of the Israeli cabinet, Bezalel Smotrich, to starve Palestinians to death. And the only reason Israel cannot do that, actually it is doing it, but the only reason it can't be done in the definitive manner that he prefers is because Israel's so-called allies, like the United States, object. This is a kind of state that, is in danger of evoking the sort of response that the Nazi Party got when it espoused genocide and proceeded to implement it. The Nazis, at least, had the decency to try to hide their evil deeds. These are done in the open and with pride. So this is a question: can the world tolerate this kind of behavior indefinitely? And I suspect the answer is no, but it will take time. And therefore, Mr. Netanyahu is not the protector of the state of Israel or the vindicator of Zionism. He is its destroyer.
Smotrich's recent comment on on the moral justification of starving 2 million people was particularly egregious, given the recent Financial Times survey said that 22% of the Palestinian population are in a catastrophic level of food shortage. 33% is in emergency, which also means large food gaps, and almost 44% is in crisis, which also means large food gaps. And interestingly, like 0% has been able to actually meet the adequate levels of nutrition. So it's not just rhetoric; it's happening on the ground. On the unprecedented unity between Shia and Sunni, it was very interesting for me to observe the comments of the Saudi diplomats at the recent OIC meetings, where they stood firmly with the Iranian insofar as this recent assassination was concerned. Ambassador Freeman, if you could quickly comment a little bit on how you see the emerging role of particularly countries like Jordan and Egypt, but also you can comment on Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And I'm asking this because there seems to be two views. One view says that they are generally the allies of the US, and they have exchanged internal security for giving up completely on any kind of justice or Arab nationalism, if you like. And they don't represent the will of their own population, particularly in Jordan, where there is a large segment of Palestinian population. Then there is the other view that says that Jordan and Qatar, but also Egypt, they are trying very hard to negotiate in maintaining restraints on both sides, Iran and Israel. How do you look at the role of these states?
Well, I think they exemplify, in fact, they epitomize, maybe they exaggerate the gap between ruler and ruled that I referred to in the context of American and other democracies. Polls that have been taken in places like Saudi Arabia show that the last one I saw, which was a while back, but things have not improved, showed that 96% of Saudis favored any country that had relations with Israel breaking them over the genocide. I think the same is probably true in Jordan. Jordan has very limited options. It's a buffer state between Israel and other parts of the Arab world, Syria and Iraq in particular, a buffer state between Saudi Arabia and Israel. That's why it exists, because it is convenient for all concerned. It's a buffer for Israel as well. And if there is, as I do not believe there will be, a repetition of the April 1st Iranian missile attack on Israel, Jordan will, in its own interest, defend its airspace. That has the effect of defending Israel. I think the latter proposition is true. That is, these countries, for their own reasons of their own national interest and domestic stability, tranquility, are trying very hard to moderate what is happening. So far, they have failed to succeed. Even the United Arab Emirates, which you didn't mention, which I regard as the supreme practitioner of realpolitik in the region, has now basically it retains a dialogue with Israel, but about Gaza, but it is clearly not cooperative with Israeli aspirations. And this is all very relevant because there is this absurd idea that somehow whatever is left of Gaza, which has already been rendered uninhabitable, where much of the population, as you indicated, is either dead or starving to death, but this will somehow be administered by some kind of Arab force coordinating with Israel after the war is over, whatever that means. The war, of course, as I said, has been going on for 76 years, so it's not going to be over if the fighting ceases in Gaza. This is simply, this would be an invitation for revolution in many of these countries were they to agree to that. And rulers in these countries are far from stupid. They will not be duped into that. As for their relationship with the United States, I think, in Islam you can have 4 wives, can't you? the United States is one of the wives. All of these countries are trying to diversify their international protection, reaching out to India, to China, to Russia, to others, even Brazil, and European countries. None of them want to put all their security in one foreign country protector's hands. So I think the United States, unfortunately for them, is too big and fat to throw out of the bed. You cannot ignore the presence of the United States as the largest arms manufacturer and vendor in the world, or the size of the American economy, even if, as in the case of Saudi Arabia, you no longer export significant amounts of energy, and the United States has emerged, in fact, as a competitor in energy market. So I think we have contradictory trends here. But again, these rulers, are not stupid. They know that they need some support from the United States, as much as they can get, to remain in power. And I think you can see this very clearly with the Saudi demands that were brought up in the context of the American effort to broker a normalization of relations with Israel, in addition to demanding that Israel address the Palestinian issue, which of course it and the United States have tried to bypass, most notably in the Abraham Accords. In addition to that, the Saudis basically asked for the moon. They asked for a defense treaty, which could only go through the Senate if it had the Zionist lobby's ardent support, and the Congress behaved the way they did with Mr. Netanyahu's speech, which I frankly doubt they would. It asked for the full nuclear fuel cycle in order to be able to compete in nuclear terms with Iran. That would never go through the Congress, and it asked for uncontrolled imports of American weaponry, which also is not going to happen. So Saudi Arabia basically, in my view, in those discussions, was walking through the bazaar and looking at the goods and saying, making casual offers and inviting the purchase of the rugs it was carrying to see how much it could get, not because they wanted to get rid of the rugs. So this was interesting. But basically, the Saudis were exploiting the American subservience to Israeli interests, because it's very hard to see how an Israeli-Saudi normalization does anything at all for the United States. It does a lot of things for Israel if it happens, because it would provide the legitimization that Israel has lacked as a result of its behavior. Israel has existed for 76 years. It has not made a single friend or persuaded anyone in the region that it is legitimate. And it has just engaged in acts which have delegitimized it, not only in the region and in the broader Islamic world, but in almost all of the world, even in much of the West, to some extent, not apparently on Capitol Hill.
I want to shift places a little bit and discuss Russia, but start with North Korea. We actually had Professor Bruce Cummins, University of Chicago professor, who has extensively written on North Korea, and we did a show with him on North Korea, which was a very decent show. I was also listening to one of your recent interviews where you spoke about North Korea's potential relationship with China and Russia. And I wanted to ask this question because I think that's one area where your view is in diametrical opposition to Professor Cummins' view. Professor Cummins thinks that North Korea's future lies with its good relationship with China, and his logic is that Russia can offer it cheap oil and at best military technology, which he thinks it doesn't need anyway because it's one of the largest garrison state. It needs more technology and ways to rebuild its economy. You, on the other hand, argued that, and he also talks about the historical relationship of, the North Korean leadership fighting in the civil war in China and so on. But your argument is that North Korea has a deeper relationship with Russia, which I think he wouldn't agree in the post-reconstruction phase. But you also seem to suggest that it should continue to have a deeper relationship with Russia. Can you respond to his thoughts?
Sure. I have very great respect for Professor Cummings. I've read his books, which gave me a completely different perspective on the Korean War and the origins of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And it's absolutely true that 7 divisions of the North Korean Army, the Korean People's Liberation Army, which marched south on June 25, 1950, were from the People's Liberation Army in China. They were ethnic Korean divisions who had been battle-hardened in warfare in the Chinese Civil War. That is true. And it's also true that the Chinese supported North Korea, or the continued existence of North Korea as a buffer state in response to the American drive north over the 38th parallel. And so that is all true. The Chinese withdrew, I believe, in 1957 from North Korea. There have been repeated reports by North Koreans of Chinese efforts to engineer a regime change in Pyongyang. Historically, China has been, or what is now China, and not necessarily Han Chinese, but people living in, let's say, Manchuria or in North China, whether they were Han or not, have been the enemies of various kingdoms on the Korean Peninsula. There's quite a history. Korea has been invaded 72 times, almost always from the north, sometimes by Japan, once by the United States. Anyway, I think the historic relationship is important. Obviously, Korean culture reflects a tremendous Chinese influence. Until fairly recently, Hanja, Chinese characters, were used to write in Korean, much like Japanese. Korean is an inflected language, so you have to add other elements to read correctly. But North Korea first went against Hanja and adopted Hangul, the syllabic writing system that was invented, I think, in the 14th century. Maybe I'm wrong about that. King Seljuk, I believe. Anyway, it's a brilliant writing system. And the demonstration of Korean nationalism that the abandonment of Chinese characters represented was challenged South Korea to do the same, and it did. The first time I went to Seoul, I could read all the street signs because they were in Hansa, in Chinese characters, Hanja. Subsequently, they were erased. So the relationship is very complicated. Yes, there is a historical military connection. Yes, North Korea is very important as a buffer state to China. Much of the 1950s and 60s were spent by the Chinese imagining an American invasion of North China through the Bohai Gulf, staged out of Korea. And so they have taken the continued existence of the DPRK very seriously. On the other hand, they utterly despise the DPRK. They have no use for it at all. The epithet that Nikita Khrushchev applied to the Chinese in the Cultural Revolution, he called it pantsless communism, is now applied by the Chinese to the North Koreans. There's no admiration for this regime at all. It is a source of refuge.
For their internal dynamics.
Yeah. And of course, there are historical incidents. For example, the murder by North Korea by Kim Jong-il, the father of the current ruler, of 13 members of the South Korean cabinet in Rangoon at the very moment that Deng Xiaoping was trying to broker a peace in Korea. There's no trust. There is a very awkward relationship. And in this context, North Korea has now adopted a policy of balance. It actually, when Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, not very bright Secretary of State, went to Pyongyang, she was told by Kim Jong-il that he wanted to switch sides. He didn't want to be aligned with China. He wanted to be aligned with the United States. And she was so enmeshed in the established narrative that she didn't understand what she was being told. Or so I have heard from multiple sources. Anyway, North Korea has now given up the idea of peaceful reunification of the peninsula. It hasn't given up the idea of marching south if the opportunity presents itself. But its policy is now balance. And Russia is a tremendously effective balance against China, which the North Koreans, like the South Koreans, both they have a love-hate relationship with. I would argue, and I have speculated, that given this change in policy, there is an opportunity for Japan to become part of the North Korean balance equation. And the North Koreans have cards to play with Japan, like the abductees that North Korea took from Japan, which may or may not be alive. North Korea says they aren't, but one never knows. Anyway, North Korea now has declared its independence from the other Koreans. It's declared it is independent from China. It will use Russia to balance China. It has rejected much of the Chinese economic model, despite persistent efforts by the Chinese to educate it to the merits of things like free trade zones and private sector activity. It is now sui generis. It is dynastic communism. The Soviet Union has disappeared. The Russian Federation is there in its place. China has changed. It is not the China of Mao Zedong anymore. North Korea is sui generis. And so it is out for its own good, and its own good lies in the immediate future in intensified cooperation with Russia. That will enable the further modernization of its missiles and nuclear warheads, as well as other equipment. And it stands with Russia. It's buying Russian support by supplying engineers for the Ukraine war, as well as ammunition. So this is all good for North Korea. The problem with China, from the North Korean point of view, Russia's a bit far away, but China is very close, and China is potentially subversive. If North Korea were to follow the Chinese model of opening and reform, you would see something that would make the Tiananmen uprising look like nothing at all. This is a very fragile, brittle regime at heart. It rules by terror, and it does not have the ability, in my view, or in its own view, to survive an opening. So for all these reasons, I don't agree that the future will be determined by China. I think Koreans will determine their own future. They've had a habit of doing that for several thousand years, and I don't think they're going to give that up.
Yeah, I think in all fairness, even Professor Cummins didn't say it would be determined by China. I think his point was its future should lie more with China than Russia. If you want North Korea to progress beyond pantsless communism, yes. Professor Cummings, having spent his life studying that regime, would like to
certain sympathy for the Koreans who live in it, and I can understand that. But for the reasons I mentioned, North Korea has never been willing to follow the Chinese model.
I think I want to end it with, if you have the time, I have two questions, but at least I wanted to ask this question on a little bit of update on the Ukraine-Russia war, because the genocide in Palestine has kind of eclipsed our attention, but the Financial Times and other press has reported this new escalation recently on the Kursk sector. I guess it's the northeastern Ukraine-Russia border. On one hand, as per a Finland-based military research institution, Ukraine is facing severe manpower crisis, as well as material crisis. On the other hand, recent NATO summit also doubled down on its willingness to continue this fight, and we are seeing these new escalations, almost desperate attempts, because it's also reported that Ukraine has lost like twice the area that it had liberated 1 year ago. What's your sense of where this war is heading towards, and do you see a negotiated settlement out of this war anytime soon?
That's a lot of questions all in one. I think the diversionary attack on Kursk is just that. It's intended to boost Ukrainian morale. It's intended to show Western backers that Ukraine still can isolate and weaken Russia, which is the Western policy that Ukraine has been useful for. Unfortunately, of course, the area itself was very lightly defended, but unfortunately for the Ukrainians, it's very risky. The effort to divert Russian attention from other fronts, specifically in Donetsk, is unlikely to succeed. And more particularly, going on the attack is very risky and very painful and costly in terms of casualties. And I suspect these two formations that went into the Russian territory are very unlikely to emerge intact, if at all. This is a desperate political measure. It may be intended by Mr. Zelensky, who is now more and more obviously convinced that there has to be a negotiation, maybe an effort to the last throw of the dice to strengthen his hand in negotiations by showing that Ukraine can in fact be exactly what the Russians fear, namely a platform for attack on Russia. That is, of course, why Russia has demanded that Ukraine return to the neutrality it originally proclaimed at its independence. Anyway, do I see an early end to this? No, I don't. I do see some very useful activities going on. But Mr. Orban went to Kyiv, went to Moscow, went to Beijing, went to Washington, and then went to Mar-a-Lago. He was representing the interests of Hungary, not those of the EU, as formulated by the EU, although I think what he was trying to do, which was to jumpstart a dialogue about peace, a negotiation, or set the framework for a negotiation, was enormously valuable to the EU, and they will come to value it, even though at the moment they are denigrating him for his indiscipline. Along with that, Mr. Zelensky, having staged a couple of so-called peace conferences, which were actually political rallies in support of the side in the war. The Russians were not invited. Can't make peace with nobody. You have to have your opponent there. Has now said that he needs to have Russia at the table in a peace conference. So that suggests a level of realism that was not there before. And I think, politics are changing. Boris Johnson, who sabotaged the original draft peace treaty that Ukraine and Russia worked out, is not in power anymore. Different people are in power, the Labour Party in England. The Europeans are quite divided, not just, you have Hungary and Slovakia arguing for peace, you have France arguing for strategic autonomy, of course, doing it in French, which means that other people suspect it's Gaullist in inspiration, probably correctly. I actually agree with Macron that Europe should pursue strategic autonomy, but he can't do that without a different relationship with Germany and the rest of Europe than he has. Lots of things are happening, and we're about to have an election in the United States, and whereas it had promised to be a very boring, inconsequential event in terms of policies on things like Gaza and Ukraine and Iran and whatever, China, it now looks like it could be a more consequential event. I don't know what it will mean, but the fact that I don't know is already an advance. Every war must end. War termination should be built into the calculations at the start of any war. I think Mr. Putin, from the beginning, has demanded a negotiation. It was the refusal of the West to negotiate that led him to use force. He has always said that he's really willing to negotiate. As time has gone on, his demands have escalated as he has made advances on the battlefield. The prospect is that if war goes on much longer, his demands will further escalate. Time is not on Ukraine's side, manifestly, and we will see what happens. Mr. Putin originally said he wouldn't negotiate with Zelensky because Zelensky has no legitimacy. He's in office beyond his term. As president, he canceled the elections. He may not be as popular in Ukraine as he once was. Mr. Zelensky said he wouldn't negotiate with Mr. Putin, but now both seem to have relented. So there's hope. Not much, but a little bit.
Also, the U.S. election, while it might be very inconsequential for Palestine, it may or may not be that inconsequential when it comes to Ukraine, if at least if Donald Trump comes to power. We don't know actually how
exactly. We don't know. And here I think it's very important to note that, as you know from your time in the United States, American voters do not vote on foreign policy issues. They vote on domestic issues. Nonetheless, their votes will determine what happens.
Can I leave you with one very quick question, like that to cap this interview, if you allow?
A quick question?
Yes.
I mean, simple question.
Yes.
That would be a change.
This is like I would like to cap this with this broader question on U.S.-China relationship. I was thinking about these two kind of worldviews, one represented by, let's say, John Mearsheimer, who says that there would always be conflict between China and the US, and that's the sort of great power conflict. And then there is a Jeffrey Sachs point of view, who says that it doesn't necessarily have to be such an intense conflict and competition, because we can also cooperate. I am very interested, given your history with China and diplomacy, which way do you lean?
Somewhere in the middle, I suppose. John Mearsheimer, who I think is brilliant and very honest and a very useful spokesman for views that have to be heard on many issues, is, I think, he is a graduate of West Point, which the last time I looked was a military academy, and a student of power politics in the European context. I think he's too mechanistic on China. Mm-hmm. I have the same problem with his theory there that I do with Graham Allison's discovery of the so-called Thucydides trap. Too mechanistic. Nothing is foreordained in that matter. Jeffrey Sachs, I think, correctly perceives the opportunities that a wealthier China would represent, and the opportunities for cooperation on planet-wide problems like climate change and nuclear proliferation and other issues. China is basically a peacemaker. It has positioned itself as such. So I would say that my response to your question is that China is a major challenge to two aspects of the United States position. First, simply by rising and returning to wealth and power, and by now accounting for 36% of global manufacturing, by having an economy that in domestic purchasing power terms is a third larger than the US economy, China is a threat to US primacy or hegemony internationally. Whether China intends to be a threat is an open question. My sense is the Chinese are pursuing their own interests. They are not looking at the United States every morning and trying to figure out how they can ace out Washington. They want to be respected. They want to be preeminent in science and technology, as they once were. And they want to recover China's position in the world. Now, of course, they are a world power, not just a regional power. And this is, of course, a challenge to the United States because we haven't faced this for quite a while. Second, we were the largest economy in the world as of about 1870. Now we're not in meaningful terms, in my view. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the American response to virtually everything these days is militaristic. We look at the world through a military lens. So we see China as a military threat. But there's no evidence whatsoever that China wants to do anything militarily but end its civil war. That is, recover the bastion of Taiwan, which the United States during the Korean War protected, so that the Chinese Civil War would not end as it would have otherwise done in the conquest of Taiwan. Taiwan has emerged as a robust democracy. It's admirable in very many respects. If you take an ideological position on foreign policy rather than a realist position, then defending Taiwan is very worthwhile. If you take a position that says, well, actually, the greatest value of the democratic experiment in Taiwan would be if Taiwan were able to convey some or all of that to the mainland by working out its differences with the mainland, then you say, well, actually, why are we militarizing this? We should be trying to promote a peaceful dialogue and gain time for the wounds of the Civil War and the demands of the Chinese Revolution of 1949 to fade as the demands of the Revolution of 1911 have faded. So I would argue for a different strategy. I would say militarily we should be wary. We should not be in China's face. We are in danger of provoking the Chinese to cross the Pacific and be in our face. We have mishandled our relations with some of our neighbors to the south in a way that gives the Chinese opportunities, if they care to take them, to pose a direct strategic menace to us. They don't pose any such menace at present. What they do pose is a challenge to our sense of our primacy and our honor. We have given our word that we will defend Taiwan, we think. Actually, we haven't quite. And we're honor-bound to do that. And the Chinese are in front of that. But so, as I say, I'm somewhere in the middle. I think China is primarily an economic and scientific and technological challenge, not a military one. I think we could gain a great deal by cooperating with the Chinese and leveraging their prosperity to our own. I think the course that we are on risks many interests of the United States and actually is accelerating the loss of our primacy rather than inhibiting or retarding it. So I don't like great theoretical formulations, right, whether they are appealing or not. I think one should look at relations between countries in terms of their specific components and do it through inductive reasoning empirically rather than from deductive reasoning. Grand theories like offensive realism or, Jeffrey Sachs has a certain liberal ideology, which is, I find, very appealing, but I'm not convinced that it explains or prescribes the correct course in all circumstances.